Yes, hi. I am a writer from New York. The novel that I just finished, I'm happy to say, is coming out next year, next spring. Um, Takes place in the city, it takes place in the 80s, and I spent a lot of time very immersed in New York City history. And when I was done with it, I needed to go to very far away, very open sky, really arriving at the silence of myself again and feeling in touch with something a lot bigger than myself, which when you're really working on a project, could be an art project, can be anything, you can really get into your own head in that way. So I wanted open spaces, and so I'm so happy to be here in Wyoming at Nelchie's beautiful vision. You were saying, I wish I could have met her. I wish I could have met her too, but I feel like we are meeting her every day doing this work, so I'm just really pleased to be here. So I'm going to read the very first chapter of my novel, which is called Waiting on a Friend. It does take place in New York. It takes place in the early 80s, and it is about the early days of the HIV/AIDS crisis, which started in New York, started in San Francisco, started coming into our conscious, started in these coastal places, and then, becomes the world's problem over time. And it's about a woman who can see ghosts. It's told from her perspective. And as the AIDS crisis starts to build, she's seeing more of her friends in ghost form. So if that's not your cup of tea, you might want to take a note about that. Though I will say, if it's not your cup of tea, I got bad news for you about art in general. So this is the first chapter of Waiting on a Friend, and it's called Ghosts. When Mark died, I thought I'd start seeing him around more. I saw John Labriglio standing on 14th Street with his hands in his pockets, for instance, right after his memorial. He was keeping tabs on who showed. I helped Billy Kellerman save his beautiful clothes from being thrown into the trash, and then confronted him after his two-faced ex made off with his boots. The first of the Davids to die, David Green, bugged me for a month about getting in touch with his lover, who had died in December. I wanted to know why he thought I could help, if ghosts gossip or what, but he just kept asking about Paul. I said to him, look, David, you can't get possessive. Why don't you try Ohio, since that's where they took him away? Why don't you go haunt his family instead of me? That father of his deserves a little responsibility. He said he already tried, that he had gone to Paul's funeral in Akron, and no one knew who he was. Eventually, I had to break it to David that Paul had already moved on, and that when I had seen him, he hadn't asked about David. Mark died of complications. Don't we all, he would have said. June 5th, 1984, 11:42 p.m., Bellevue Hospital. That night, I was home. I was supposed to go see our friend Leon, but I had one of those terrible headaches you get when the weather changes and everything, even your scalp hurts, and besides, I was hungover. So I laid in bed with a bag of frozen peas melting on my forehead, half reading last week's New York Magazine. I'd grabbed it from a stack left by the trash because the headline interested me. The Lower East Side, there goes the neighborhood. I had been hearing that line my whole life, or at least since they actually used to call it the Lower East Side, not the East Village, but I couldn't deny that things were changing more quickly than usual. Anyway, the phone didn't ring once, and I was home all night. The next morning, I got the call. It was a friend of mine, Michael something, who used to be in a band with Joe and Kurt, and who first introduced Mark to Patrick, his last boyfriend. Someone must have said, okay, who's going to tell Renata? That's 11 hours he was dead, and I didn't know. I had assumed I would be with him when he died. Hearing is the last sense to go, I've learned. When the time came, I planned to put my lips to his ears and tell him it would be okay, that he was loved, that we would remember him always, that he wasn't alone, and he could let go now. I thought it would be important for him to know he didn't have to hang on or around for anyone. I had pictured it happening so when the day came, I would know what to do. I thought it would be in the day. I thought there would be light. It would be a well-lit, clean hospital room, even though I didn't know anyone who had received a decent send-off. Paul, who had also died in Bellevue, told me that his deathbed had a pool of blood under it left over from the last guy because none of the orderlies would touch it. You'd think a guy could at least die in a pool of his own goddamn blood, he said, shaking his head. Mark wouldn't die in our apartment. He couldn't die in the home we shared for 10 years. It would have to be in a hospital because if he died at home, someone would have to take his body. I had thought all this through. I couldn't help it. I pictured him at peace, and I pictured us alone. Maybe that's selfish of me. He had a lot of friends. We have a lot of friends. And then I would stay with his body until they made me leave, and then I'd get myself to the diner and drink a bottomless cup of weak coffee. And after that, I couldn't imagine. But instead, Patrick took Mark to the ER one night when Mark couldn't breathe. Patrick didn't tell anyone but a few of his own friends. He didn't call me. After I got the phone call, I don't know why I did it, probably to take it out on someone, I decided to tell his mother. His folks were in the phone book. Mark died, I said. Your son, I added, to remind her. She just cleared her throat and said, in a paper-thin voice, "Thank you for letting me know." I could hear her gently hang up the phone. 2 days later, there was a polite message on our machine. There would be a service at the Norwegian Seamen's Church in Brooklyn, and I could tell anyone appropriate. I didn't know who that meant, so I told everyone. Christians, it turns out, take their sweet time putting a body in the ground, so I had a whole week before his funeral. I can barely imagine how I got through it. I couldn't believe I had to keep getting up every morning, and he was the one who usually made the coffee. But I know I looked for him everywhere. I walked river to river and sat at our table at the Ukrainian place and went to the movies and sat in the back row where we used to laugh through the whole film and went dancing and expected him to show whenever I heard one of our songs. I was sure that the right needle drop would bring him back because our time together had been taken from us, and if he could, he would come back to claim it. But in all honesty, that feeling of stolen time wasn't just because he died at 29, but because for the past few weeks, he had been spending his nights at Patrick's. It had been a while since we just hung out all day, reading out good passages over books to each other, one of us going to get some beer while the other made spaghetti, ready to see where the night went. The apartment felt like it was waiting for him too. When someone dies, their stuff is still right where they left it. That one gray sock could stay on the floor forever. The glass with one sip of water left will evaporate. I tried to be patient. I thought he might do something cheeky, like tap me on the shoulder during his funeral, so I waited. It might have been an easier week if there were rules for seeing ghosts, or patterns for who came back and who didn't, and why, and after how much time had passed. In the movies, ghosts have scores to settle, or they come back after dying in some horrific way, or because the person was too evil to truly be killed. I don't believe any of that. I figure that some people become ghosts because they don't like moving, on or otherwise. Sometimes the ghosts I saw wanted help or asked for something specific, but most of the time they just wanted to be acknowledged, a nod on their way to who knows. Sometimes they didn't bother with me at all. The first ghost I ever saw in the city who I knew personally was my old girlfriend Julie's dad, who died in '78. I was on my way over to her parents' place on Grand to pay my respects when there he was, sitting in the same folding chair outside his brother-in-law's pharmacy where he always sat, arms crossed, smoking a cigarette that I swear glowed cold, like I could touch the tip and not burn myself. I think I said something stupid to him like, "I'm sorry you died," but he kept frowning. Julie used to complain that her dad spoke perfect English, but chose not to unless he had to. So if he needed something, he could have found the words. This is all to say that ghosts weren't necessarily interested in me just because I could see them. By the time Mark died, I knew a lot of the dead people I saw. I had a decade of practice at this point, so not only could I spot them, I could usually find a way to communicate with them if it seemed like they wanted to. They could be mysterious, but sometimes they just wanted to shoot the shit. It's true that even the chatty ghosts, and there were a few, still had a sadness about them that weighed down the pleasure we shared in gossiping about the living. Mark's friend, Vaughn, for instance, had to tell me a particularly juicy story about his former lover, a closet-case banker with a wife and kids back in Leonia. But I think he'd tell anybody who was listening. Ghosts like someone to listen, someone to agree how fucked it all is. Everyone wants that. I'll give you a second. Except me, I guess. I barely spoke to anyone. So I had this delirious week where I just waited, doing God knows what with myself, barely sleeping, not eating all day, and then realizing I was starving, so I'd chew on some ravioli without even boiling them. I know I went to the shop because I got paid for the week. The phone rang a lot, and it wasn't Mark. I let my machine answer all my calls and then erase the messages so his voice would be saved. All right, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Have you had a personal friend or family member die of AIDS?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes, and my aunt was also a hospice nurse for people with AIDS. She became a nurse actually because her best friend, she was in a biker gang in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and her best friend got very sick. There was no treatment. It was 1987. He died very quickly, and she couldn't believe it, how people were left behind. And she went to nursing school. You know, she had nothing more than her high school education. She went to nursing school right away, became a nurse, and did hospice care for people who were very left behind and dying in really awful ways. And, you know, I really believe that people ought to take care of one another. And my novel is dedicated to her because it was, you know, not something, it affected her personally, but I believe that we shouldn't have to just know someone or be affected personally to care about issues like this, because it could be any of us at any time. Yeah, thank you for that question.
Natalie, when you sit down to write with so much going through your mind about what to get down on paper,
Mm-hmm.
how do you orchestrate that time or when you're going to do it? Or is, not to put words in your mouth, but does a thought just come in your head and you go, I've got to get that down on paper? Or do you have so much and you wait until, oh no, I'm going to wait until I can sit down and write 2 hours every day or 10 hours or whatever the case might be?
I mean, there's no perfect moment unless you're here at Jentel, you know, then there's nothing but perfect moments. So, you know, if I'm in my dedicated work time and I've got my laptop and I've got my notebooks, I've got different places to jot things down, to make a note. Otherwise, I always have a notebook with me. I always have a little something to try to capture that thought, no matter what. I'm never without something to write on in case I have that right idea. And then sometimes it doesn't come in handy until much later. But then I'll go through old notebooks and I'll think, oh, you know what, I actually already thought about this issue and I had this idea. So it's like writing yourself a little note for later. It's nice. Yeah.